U.S. government had only limited powers and responsibility to deal with what was, he believed, a private economic crisis. There was no widespread presumption, as there is today, that the government was responsible for the state of the economy or for alleviating the suffering of its citizens. The election of Roosevelt in 1932 and his 3 re-elections initiated an entirely new level of government activism. For the first time, the national government assumed responsibility for the economic well-being of its citizens on a substantial scale. Relying on the theory mentioned earlier, that foreign affairs are thought to justify greater presidential powers than domestic affairs, Roosevelt portrayed himself as waging war against the Depression and sought from Congress the powers that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. The New Deal programs he put in place tremendously increased the size of the federal establishment and its budget. The number of civilians, non-military personnel, working for the federal government increased by more than 50% during Roosevelt's first 2 terms, 1933 to 1941. The crisis of the Great Depression created the conditions for extraordinary action, and Roosevelt's leadership created new responsibilities and opportunities for the federal government. Congress delegated a vast amount of discretionary power to Roosevelt so that he could implement his New Deal programs. The legacy of the New Deal is that Americans now look to the president and the government to regulate the economy, solve social problems, and provide political inspiration. No other president has had such a profound impact on how Americans live their lives today. Roosevelt's New Deal was followed by Truman's Fair Deal. Eisenhower's presidency was less activist, but it was followed by Kennedy's New Frontier and Johnson's Great Society. All of these comprehensive policy programs did less than they promised, but they reinforced Americans' belief that it is the government's, and in particular the president's, job to make ambitious promises. That, combined with the ascendance of the United States as a world power, its engagement in the Cold War, and its participation in undeclared wars such as Korea and Vietnam, made the office very powerful indeed, what historian Arthur Schlesinger called, in a 1973 book, the Imperial Presidency. The philosophy behind the Imperial Presidency was summed up neatly by Nixon, ironically several years after he was forced to resign, when he declared, when the president does it, that means it's not illegal. The modern presidency, bolstered by court rulings that supported the president's inherent powers in foreign affairs, generated something of a backlash in Congress over the belief that neither the Johnson nor the Nixon administration had been sufficiently forthcoming over the Vietnam War. Frustration with that, as well as with Nixon's abuse of his powers during Watergate and his unwillingness to spend budgeted money as Congress had appropriated it, led Congress to pass the War Powers Act, 1973, which we discussed earlier, the Foreign Intelligence and Surveillance Act, 1978, designed to put a check on the government's ability to spy on people within the United States, and the Independent Counsel Act, 1978, which was intended to provide an impartial check on a president's activities but was ultimately left open to abuse. The battle over executive authority today. The modern presidency had been so diminished by post-Watergate developments and the Clinton impeachment that when the Bush administration came to power, Bush and his vice president, Dick Cheney, were determined to restore the luster and power of the office. In January 2002, Vice President Cheney remarked that the presidency is weaker today as an institution because of the unwise compromises that have been made over the last 30 to 35 years, and he highlighted the erosion of the powers and the ability of the President of the United States to do his job. Indeed, many of Bush's executive orders were designed to bolster presidential powers, including by the appointment of czars to head new executive offices created solely on the executive's authority, as were his administration's expansive claims of executive privilege. In addition, Bush expanded the practice of using signing statements, specifications of the president's interpretation of what a law obligated him to do, and understanding that could not be vetoed or checked by Congress. Typically, presidents used the presidential veto to block legislation they didn't like, whereupon Congress could override the veto if the bill had sufficient support. But unlike his predecessors, Bush had not vetoed a single bill by the time he had been in office for 5 years. Instead, he had issued a huge number of signing statements, more than 750, compared to 232 by his father in his 4 years in the White House, and only 140 issued by Clinton in his 8 years. Many of Bush's actions reflected a strong commitment to the theory of the unitary executive, a controversial legal view that was first articulated by members of Reagan's administration. Today, this complicated and nuanced view is held by an assortment of conservative politicians and scholars, including those at think tanks like the Heritage Foundation. The theory of the unitary executive argues that the Constitution requires all executive power be held exclusively by the president and, therefore, cannot be delegated to or wielded by any other branch. In its strongest forms, it puts the executive, rather than the legislature, at the pinnacle of the American power hierarchy and sees many, if not all, checks on presidential authority as illegitimate. Critics of the Bush administration howled when they realized what was going on, accusing Bush of doing an end run around Congress and claiming that he was setting up himself, and thus the executive branch, as the ultimate decider of what is constitutional, a function generally thought to belong to the Supreme Court. There is no question that this administration has been involved in a very carefully thought out, systematic process of expanding presidential power at the expense of the other branches of government, said one scholar. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, provided Bush and Cheney with a strong and persuasive rationale for their desire to create a more muscular presidency. Citing concern about future attacks, the Bush administration increased its efforts to make the office more powerful, and his extraordinarily high approval ratings in the days following the attacks made Congress reluctant to take him on. The Republicans in Congress were supportive of the administration's efforts, and the Democrats feared being seen as soft on terrorism and so went along with Bush's plans. He was able to initiate the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq for reasons that were later shown to have been largely exaggerated and fabricated, and the Patriot Act passed handily in 2001. Only the Supreme Court, in the 2004 case Handy v. Rumsfeld and the 2006 case Handon v. Rumsfeld, attempted to put on the brakes. As we argue in this chapter, high approval ratings can give a president power beyond that granted by the Constitution, and Bush used that power throughout his first term. Only after Bush's re-election in 2004, with waning approval ratings, was he seen as vulnerable enough for Congress to criticize him seriously. By 2006, his public approval was so low that Democrats easily won back control of both the House and the Senate and began to undertake the job of congressional oversight that had been largely lacking for the previous 6 years. President Obama, a former constitutional law professor, arrived at the White House showing no signs of embracing the Bush philosophy of the unitary executive. He had been critical of many of Bush's actions and seemed aware of the dangers of an expanded executive. Still, for most of his 2 terms in office, he faced a Republican-controlled Congress that had expressed a determination to block as much of his agenda as they could. As relations between the White House and Capitol Hill became impossibly strained, the president turned more and more to executive action to get his agenda accomplished. Although the magazine Politico found that most of Obama's actions would take some time to make their impact felt, they included a higher minimum wage for federal workers and anti-discrimination measures in the federal workplace for LGBTQ+ people, a new retirement savings plan, new workplace reforms, efforts to halt climate change by boosting fuel efficiency standards and reducing emissions, the creation of a marine sanctuary, assistance repaying student loans, regulation of for-profit colleges, small business assistance, a change in the loophole that allowed those purchasing guns at gun shows to avoid background checks, changes in immigration policy, the institution of net neutrality, and other similar programs that could be accomplished with the executive pen or by encouraging executive agencies to act in a particular way. As executive actions, few, if any, of these decisions have survived beyond Obama's presidency. Although Obama's political legacy has been significant and his approval ratings as he ended his term were in the mid-50s, Trump's victory allowed the Republicans to reverse much of Obama's work, including doing some major damage to his signature health care plan. All presidents and Congresses have at least occasionally adversarial relationships, but Obama may be one of the few presidents whose conflict with Congress survives his administration. Trump, in fact, promised to undo as much of Obama's legacy as he could, as quickly as he could. The Trump presidency. Trump differed from other presidents from the beginning by deciding not to forgive those who didn't vote for him. Most presidents reach out to the other side and, especially when dealing with issues of national concern, try to speak not as a partisan politician but as a non-political head of state. Trump largely bypassed that role. When the Trumps held their first state dinner, no Democrats or journalists were invited. When tragedies like school shootings occurred, many families of victims said Trump never contacted them. When Trump did call George Floyd's brother after Floyd was killed by Minneapolis police, Phil and I's Floyd expressed some disappointment with the brief conversation they had. He kept pushing me off, like I don't want to hear what you're talking about. When Trump spoke out, it was often via tweet, which lacked the gravitas of a traditional presidential statement. But if Trump ignored the head of state role, he didn't spend a lot of time on the head of government role either. He blew up deals with Congress rather than trying to broker agreements and bring people on board his side. He showed little interest in the health of the Republican Party he still leads, and when that vacuum was filled at times by his vice president, his staff reacted with suspicion about Pence's motives. Trump's approach to governance was based partly on his personality, partly on his reliance on what worked for him in business, and partly on his refusal to learn the gritty details of how government works. Because of his lack of political background, he entered office with less of an idea of how to work with the other branches or, indeed, with the rest of the executive branch than have other new presidents. Political scientists have coined the term weak presidency to refer to presidents who do not excel at managing their executive offices. For the most part, Trump joined former President Carter in that camp. That term should not be confused with the notion that Trump is necessarily a weak man. He could be very influential with those seeking his favor, and many people were afraid of incurring his displeasure, but it does mean he wasn't a very good manager of the people around him. Perhaps his most lasting legacy will be the number of political and legal investigations into his behavior during his years in office and since he left the presidency, as discussed in the box Is the President Above the Law? The Biden presidency. Even before his inauguration, Biden had given us more clues than most incoming chief executives about how he would govern. His decades in the Senate and his 8 years as vice president, combined with the decisions he made while campaigning and during his transition, told us that if Trump broke the mold of what the conventional presidency looks like, Biden intended to get busy gluing it back together. An institutionalist who cherished the rules and norms of the government halls where he had worked for so long, Biden was in many ways the anti-Trump. From the start, in the winter of 2021, he was the mask-wearing, science-loving politician who was willing to embrace those who opposed his presidency as well as those who worked for it. His early staffing decisions sent an immediate signal that he intended to run the West Wing as a tight ship, avoiding the management errors of his predecessor, and, for the most part, his term in office bore that out. Biden's first years in office took place in the shadow of the pandemic that had begun during the campaign the year before, and of the economic emergency caused by high unemployment, severe supply chain issues, and crippling burdens on the healthcare and education sectors. When prices started to rise, the president and his financial advisors believed that they were looking at a temporary phenomenon that would quickly dissipate as the economy stabilized. Biden worked with Democrats and even some Republicans to get stimulus bills and an infrastructure bill passed, but even when unemployment returned to low levels, prices didn't level off. Immediately, Republicans blamed the Democrats for worsening inflation by pushing more money into the economy, but in fact, the complexity of the moment made it difficult to pinpoint a single cause of the economic pain. The pandemic, still not over, had left a huge mark. Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine reduced European access to oil and drove prices still higher. Ukraine, the breadbasket of the world, was hardly in a position to keep the world fed, which did nothing to stop food prices from escalating. The inflation was global, not just domestic, and the United States was experiencing nowhere near the worst effects. What looked like temporary inflationary pressures turned into a much more serious economic crisis, adding to the other issues on Biden's plate. The job of the presidency is never easy, but the number of crises the Biden administration had to deal with in a short period of time was truly unusual. Pandemic. Insurrection incited by the previous occupant of the White House, who then found himself impeached a second time, overlapping with and upstaging the new president's first days. Withdrawal from a long and unwinnable war in Afghanistan. Regular mass shootings, including one, in May 2022, in a fourth-grade classroom in Uvalde, Texas. A leaked opinion from the Supreme Court presaging an explosive ruling. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and implicit threat to the democratic world order. Global inflation. A former opponent, under criminal investigation by the new administration, who declared his candidacy for a rematch a full 2 years in advance. An ongoing threat against democracy by those who wanted to destroy voters' faith in the electoral system. Negative press surrounding many of these crises, especially the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was more deadly than most experts had anticipated, drove down Biden's initially high approval ratings. As expected, however, Biden was handling most of the issues forced on him with the skills he'd honed over more than half a century in politics. Although his legislative agenda foundered on the rocks of 2 maverick senators of his own party, he accomplished an impressive number of his goals. And although people had mocked his argument on the campaign trail that he could be a bipartisan dealmaker, in fact he saw significant progress on bipartisan bills related to violence against women, post-office reform, gun safety, a ban on forced arbitration and sexual harassment claims, the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, passed in the Senate, not the House, 2021 to 2022, a bill protecting marriage equality, and the creation of the Juneteenth federal holiday, as well as the passage of signature legislation, the American Rescue Plan Act, 2021, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, 2021, and the Inflation Reduction Act, 2022. Biden also pulled both parties together to support huge spending in support of Ukraine, even as he used his considerable experience and contacts in foreign policy to broker cooperation among European countries to present a united North Atlantic Treaty Organization front against Russia, something Putin clearly had not expected. Biden proved better at doing the job of the presidency than selling his accomplishments to the country, however. On the assumption that the country was exhausted from Trump's occupancy of the public space for 4 years, the Biden administration seemed to deliberately yield that space, apparently believing that images of competent governance would reassure the public and be sufficient to maintain the high approval ratings with which Biden entered office. Perhaps they should have thought more about the old adage concerning nature and vacuums, however. If nature abhors a vacuum, the political world abhors it 10 times more. If Biden chose not to fill the public space, something else would do it for him. Meanwhile, Trump, under multiple indictments, was getting closer to announcing his candidacy for office in 2024. As it became likely that Biden, too, would run again in 2024 and that there would be a rematch of the 2 oldest men ever to run for the office, Trump and his supporters at home and abroad began to wage a stealthy campaign against Biden, claiming that he was too old, too infirm, too incompetent to be president. The polls showed the effect. Voters thought that Biden was much more incapacitated by his age than Trump, only 2 years younger. As a result, Biden's approval ratings never recovered from the hit that they took after the Afghanistan departure, despite his accomplishments in office. Of course, while his fictional aging was being avidly consumed on social media, Biden was actually aging in the real world, in the peculiarly magnified way that the presidency almost always seems to age those who hold it. He was visibly older and shakier, his back stiffer and his voice more whispery than either had been 4 years earlier. And then came the June 2024 debate, an event the president himself had pushed to hold unusually early as a way of showing a doubtful nation he was in command of both the nation and his senses. But on the day of the debate he had a cold, and he had only recently returned from 2 back-to-back European trips and a cross-country campaign swing, all of which also happened to overlap with his son's trial and conviction. When he showed up to debate looking sick and exhausted, unable to articulate his thoughts or to call out Trump on any of his many lies, he got no benefit of the doubt or sympathy from the media, who had convinced themselves he was avoiding them because he secretly had dementia, or from the general public, who had been paying little attention to politics until now and were shaken by how old and fragile the president seemed. Although Trump was a fire hose of fabrication, spewing more than 30 lies in 90 minutes, the negative press revolved around Biden's lackluster performance. In a textbook example of what political scientist Larry Sabato called a media feeding frenzy, many in the media seemed almost determined to force him from office. What followed was a stunning month in American politics, just weeks away from the Democratic National Convention in mid-August, in which the embattled president faced down calls to leave the race from implacable media foes but also many friends and allies, including Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. Although Biden was convinced that he could still win the election, fellow Democrats pleaded with him to consider the down-ballot impact on House and Senate Democrats if the electorate was not excited enough about the election to turn out at high levels. Confronting the possibility that not only might he lose his own race to Trump, a prospect Biden considered deeply threatening to the future of American democracy, but that he could jeopardize any chance the Democrats had of retaining the Senate and taking back control of the House, Biden finally made the gut-wrenching decision to leave the race on July 21st. But rather than let the party kill its political chances by making a month-long televised spectacle of itself, he followed up his statement that he was stepping down with a strong endorsement of Kamala Harris, who made 100 phone calls in the next 10 hours to secure the support she needed from fellow elected officials and donors. Relieved Democrats quickly fell in line. In the wake of his leaving the race, Biden's party was giddy with gratitude and lavished praise on him for his self-sacrifice. Once the sting wore off, Biden, who was clearly not happy about being forced to abandon his re-election campaign, may have decided that he found a better way to burnish his legacy in doing the most selfless thing that anybody has done since George Washington, in the words of actor George Clooney. By the end of September, 2 months after his exit, the First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden, told an interviewer that she and her husband were totally at peace with his decision and the way events had turned out. .4 Presidential politics. The struggle for power in a constitutionally limited office. Presidential responsibilities and the public's expectations of what the president can accomplish have increased greatly since the start of the 20th century. But, as we have discussed, the Constitution has not been altered to give the president more power, resulting in an expectations gap that makes the job inherently challenging. To avoid failure, presidents have to seek power beyond that which is explicitly granted by the Constitution, and even beyond what they can claim as part of their inherent powers. They do that with varying degrees of success. The expectations gap and the need for persuasive power. Even those presidents who have drawn enthusiastically on their inherent powers to protect national security or conduct foreign policy, or who support the theory of the unitary executive, cannot summon the official clout needed to ensure that their legislation gets through Congress, that the Senate approves their appointments, and that other aspects of their campaign promises are fulfilled. New presidents quickly face the dilemma of having high visibility and status but limited constitutional authority. Yet people continue to run for and serve as president, and, as we have seen, they deal with the expectations gap by attempting to augment their power with executive orders, executive agreements, claims of executive privilege, signing statements, and the like. All of these give the president some ability to act unilaterally. However, to be successful with larger policy initiatives, presidents seek to develop their primary extra-constitutional power, which is, in one scholar's phrase, the power to persuade. To achieve what is expected of them, the argument goes, presidents must persuade others to cooperate with their agendas, most often members of Congress, but also the courts, the media, state and local officials, bureaucrats, foreign leaders, and especially the American public. Other scholars, however, doubt that it is really persuasion alone that allows a president to get things done. They argue that there is not a great deal of evidence that presidents are able to influence important actors, or even the public, to change their policy priorities or preferences, and that presidents' substantial policy successes are primarily due to their ability to see and exploit existing opportunities. These may be political ambitions of members of Congress, latent concerns or yearnings in the public, or changes in public mood or media attention about unexpected events, such as the economic collapse of the 2008 Great Recession or the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Presidents vary in their ability to capitalize on the political context they face as much as in their ability to single-handedly change minds, either in Washington or in the country at large. Whether the power to persuade really works for presidents or not, sometimes it is all they have in their political toolbox to get lawmakers to go along with their agendas. From this perspective, much of Biden's legislative success can be chalked up more to the historic moment in which he found himself than to his considerable legacy as a dealmaker in the Senate. Going public. A central strategy that presidents follow in their efforts to influence people inside the Beltway, that is, the Washington insiders, to go along with their agenda is to reach out and appeal to the public directly for support. This strategy of going public is based on the expectation that public support will put pressure on other politicians to give the president what they want. Presidents use their powers as both head of government and head of state to appeal to the public by creating a narrative that will make what they want seem reasonable and necessary. A president's efforts to go public can include a trip to an international summit, a town meeting-style debate on a controversial issue, the president's annual State of the Union address, or other nationally televised speeches. At the simplest level of the strategy of going public, the president just takes their case to the people. Consequently, presidential public appearances have increased greatly in the era of the modern presidency. Recent presidents have had some sort of public appearance almost every day of the week, year-round. Knowing that the White House press corps will almost always get some airtime on network news, presidents want that coverage to be favorable. Shaping news coverage so that it supports the presidential narrative and generates favorable public opinion for the president is now standard operating procedure. President Trump largely took his communication strategy into his own hands and ran it via Twitter and well-placed leaks to members of the media. Although this ensured that the media spotlight was always on him, he did not control the actual message as well as he could. The mainstream media spoke about Trump constantly, to be sure, but they did not always say what he wanted them to say. Naturally, only a popular president can use the strategy of going public effectively, so popularity ratings become crucial to how successful a president can be. Since the 1930s, the Gallup organization has been asking people, do you approve or disapprove of the way the current president is handling his job as president? The public's rating of the president, that is, the percentage saying they approve of how the president is handling the job, varies from one president to the next and also typically rises and falls within any single presidential term. The president's ratings are a kind of political barometer. The higher they are, the more effective the president is with other political and economic actors. The lower they are, the harder the president finds it to get people to go along. For the modern presidency, the all-important power to persuade is intimately tied to presidential popularity. This was perhaps one of the greatest weaknesses Trump faced. By never reaching out beyond his base, Trump guaranteed that his approval ratings would remain remarkably steady but low. His base was with him, but few other Americans supported him, which helped account for his defeat after only one term. Three factors in particular can affect a president's popularity: the cycle effect, the economy, and unifying or divisive current events. The cycle effect refers to the tendency for presidents to begin their terms of office with relatively high popularity ratings, which decline as they move through their four-year terms, see figure 7.1. During the very early months of this cycle, often called the honeymoon period, presidents are frequently most effective with Congress. Often, but not always, presidential ratings rise going into their second terms, but this seldom approaches the popularity they had immediately after being elected the first time. The post-honeymoon drop in approval may occur because by then presidents have begun to try to fulfill the handsome promises on which they campaigned. Fulfilling promises requires political action, and as presidents exercise their head of government responsibilities, they lose the head of state glow they bring with them from the election. Political change seldom favors everyone equally, and when someone wins, someone else usually loses. The cycle effect means that presidents need to present their programs early, while they enjoy popular support. Unfortunately, much opportunity available during the honeymoon period can be squandered because of inexperience, as it was for Bill Clinton. George W. Bush avoided the pitfalls of the early Clinton administration by bringing in experienced staff to the White House with him, but by summer 2001, there were definite signs that Bush's honeymoon, too, was over. Only the surge in support for the president following the September 11th attacks allowed him to break the usual cycle effect in his first term. Similarly, President Obama chose as his first chief of staff veteran White House staffer from the Clinton administration and U.S. Representative Rahm Emanuel, who helped him to accomplish an unusually ambitious legislative agenda in his first 2 years before going on to be elected mayor of Chicago. Trump, whose approval ratings were low but remarkably stable, never really enjoyed a honeymoon period, partly because a majority voted against him and he never reached out to them to include them in a unifying vision for the country. The second important factor that consistently influences presidential approval is the state of the economy. Since Franklin Roosevelt's administration, the government has taken an active role in regulating the national economy, and every president promises economic prosperity. In practice, presidential power over the economy is quite limited, but we nevertheless hold our presidents accountable for economic performance. George H.W. Bush lost the presidency in large measure because of the prolonged recession in the latter part of his term. Clinton won it with a campaign focused on his plan for economic recovery, and he left office a popular, although impeached, president because the country was prosperous. Obama came into office during what was then the worst economic recession to hit the nation since the Great Depression of the 1930s. His ratings reflected the traditional honeymoon effect, but they dropped as unemployment rose and continued to decline as the economic recovery was slower than the public hoped. Then they rose right before his re-election in 2012 and again as the economy began to pick up real steam in 2016 as his term came to an end. Although the Obama economy continued to grow in the early Trump years, Trump's approval rating seemed unaffected by the good health of the economy. Because Trump was seen as such a divisive personality and because Americans are increasingly tribal in their politics, people could approve of the economy and still not give the president credit, and vice versa. When the economy tanked following the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, his approval rating sank further, dooming his chances at re-election. Similarly, stubborn inflation and a sluggish economy brought about by the Federal Reserve's attempt to manage it helped keep Biden's approval rating at record lows during the 2022 midterm elections. A president's party struggles in the midterms anyway, and Biden's ratings made the Democrats' forecast even worse. Only public fury over the Supreme Court's rejection of women's health care autonomy, in the form of the reversal of Roe v. Wade, and at the Republican Party's enabling of Trump's coup, as revealed in the January 6 committee hearings and Trump's endorsement of election deniers, saved the midterms from being a disaster for Democrats. In the end, they experienced the best midterm results for a presidential party in 20 years. As the previous examples make clear, newsworthy current events can influence presidential approval. Even those over which the president has no control can be opportunities for them to demonstrate leadership. Besides being tests of a president's leadership, newsworthy events can be both divisive and unifying. Political controversy, almost by definition, is divisive and generally hurts presidential ratings. And, of course, controversy in politics is unavoidable even though the public at large is reluctant to accept this fact of democratic governance. Knowing that their cooperation would only bolster Obama, congressional Republicans decided to make a concerted effort to deny him support whenever they could, ensuring that bills that passed on a party line vote would be portrayed in the media narrative as controversial and would thus be unpopular. Whereas divisive events hurt presidents, unifying events can help them. Unifying events tend to be those that focus attention on president's head of state role, making them look presidential, or that deal with perceived threats to the nation. For instance, President Bush's ratings soared during the Gulf War, and his high profile was topped by his son's ratings following the terrorist attacks of 2001. President Obama experienced a small bump in his approval ratings after he announced the killing of Osama bin Laden in the spring of 2011. Most modern presidents necessarily play the ratings game, although Trump's refusal to reach out beyond the people who elected him put a ceiling on how high his ratings could go. The disaster that followed Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico was seen as the federal government's fault, but Trump's approval ratings did not take a hit, possibly because those who were likely to disapprove of his handling of the storm's aftermath already disapproved of his job performance. His handling of the separation of refugee families at border controls may have had a greater impact on his ratings, but Trump did not really try to backtrack on his actions. In the past, those who chose not to play suffered the consequences. Truman, Johnson, and Ford tended not to heed the polls so closely, and they either had a hard time in office or were not re-elected. Trump's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic over the course of his last year in office ultimately did lower his approval ratings below re-election levels, perhaps because voters saw it affecting them personally. Working with Congress. Presidents do not always try to influence Congress by going public. They must often deal directly with Congress itself, and sometimes they combine strategies and deal with the public and Congress at the same time. The Constitution gives the primary lawmaking powers to Congress. Thus, presidents need congressional cooperation to be successful with their policy agendas. This depends in part on whether they have a reputation for being an effective leader among members of Congress and other Washington elites. Such success varies with several factors, including the compatibility of the president's and Congress's goals and the party composition of Congress. Presidents usually conflict with Congress in defining the nation's problems and their solutions. In addition to the philosophical and partisan differences that may exist between the president and members of Congress, each has different constituencies to please. The president, as the one leader elected by the whole nation, needs to take a wider, more encompassing view of the national interest. Members of Congress have relatively narrow constituencies and tend to represent their particular interests. Thus, in many cases, members of Congress do not want the same things the president does. What can presidents do to get their legislation through a Congress made up of members whose primary concern is with their individual constituencies? For one thing, presidents have a staff of assistants to work with Congress. The Legislative Liaison Office specializes in determining what members of Congress are most concerned about, what they need, and how legislation can be tailored to get their support. In some cases, members just want their views to be heard, they do not want to be taken for granted. In other cases, the details of the president's program have to be explained adequately. It is electorally useful for members to have this done in person, by the president, complete with photo opportunities for release to the papers back home. When the president and the majority of Congress are of the same party, the president is more successful at getting programs passed. When presidents face divided government, that is, when the president is of a different party than the majority in one or both houses, they do not do as well. Part of the problem is that in our highly polarized politics today, passage of a bill supported by the president is evaluated not only in terms of its policy impact, but also as giving a victory to the president, which is something the opposition is loath to do. An equally important part of the problem of divided government is that members of different parties stand for different approaches and solutions to the nation's problems, and even differ on what they consider to be the problem. For example, Democrats consider mass shootings to be a problem of gun availability, Republicans see it as a mental health issue. The open space to negotiate a policy solution in that environment is vanishingly small. On the whole, Democratic presidents and members of Congress tend to be more liberal than the average citizen, and Republican presidents and members of Congress tend to be more conservative. Under divided government, presidents are not likely to succeed at getting their agendas met, see Figure 7.2. Dramatic examples of the impact of divided government can be seen in Clinton's, George W. Bush's, and Obama's administrations. For his first 2 years in office, Clinton worked with a Democratic majority in both houses, and Congress passed 86% of the bills he supported. The next 2 years, the Republicans had a majority in both houses, and Clinton's success rate dropped to 46%. Bush enjoyed impressive success, with an average of more than 3/4 of his favored bills enacted into law when he had Republican majorities in Congress. But when Bush had to deal with a Democratic Congress after the 2006 midterm election, his success rate dropped dramatically. With 96.7% of his preferred bills making it into law, Obama in 2009 had the most successful year of any president in the 56 years that Congressional Quarterly had then been keeping track. These results are attributable to the large Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate, coupled with the president's ambitious agenda and a tanking economy that required action. The 2010 midterm elections, which replaced the Democratic majority in the House of Representatives with a conservative Republican majority, spelled an end to Obama's high rate of success, dropping from an average of 91% under the Democratic majority to just more than 55% when he had to deal with the Republican House. Although Trump did not face a divided government in his first 2 years, his party's own divided priorities and the lack of congruence between his agenda and theirs led to a mostly stalemated legislative record. They passed a tax cut and approved a steady stream of federal judges, but most of Congress did not want to build a wall on the border or pass draconian immigration legislation. Once the Democrats took over the House in 2018, Trump was further stymied in getting legislation passed, especially in light of his deteriorating relationship with Speaker Pelosi. The one exception is the bipartisan cooperation after the onset of the COVID-19 crisis that brought the House, the Senate, and the White House together to try to soften the blow of a suddenly shuttered economy. Biden's slight majorities and better negotiating skills put him in a position not as strong as Obama's, who had larger majorities, but much more successful than Trump's. In fact, Biden was able to sign not only legislation supported by his own party but also several pieces of bipartisan legislation, exactly what he had promised in his campaign. Trump's second term will again start with the advantage of a united government. That doesn't guarantee him legislative success, however, especially with such a narrow House majority. The Senate, too, is close enough that a few independent-minded senators can block his plans. Divided government does not doom Washington to inaction. When national needs are pressing or the public mood seems to demand action, the president and opposition majorities have managed to pass important legislation. Biden's record of bipartisan successes in his first 2 years speaks to that. Although he didn't technically face a divided government, the ever-present filibuster meant that the Senate was effectively in the hands of the party that can block the action. But national needs do not always cause Congress to step up. This brinksmanship has played out repeatedly in an era of polarized politics.